For as long as I can remember, there hasn't been a genre of video game that's excited me as much as horror has. No matter the external atmosphere, context, personal mood, time of day, season, or anything outside of the game that could make a difference in someone's vibe, could distract the player from most of what a quality horror experience has to offer. When a game has the right feeling to it, gameplay that feels right, graphics that complement its overall style, controls carefully forged to make an adrenaline-fueled moment, and most importantly, a good scare, that game can't really be compared to any other genre or style of presentation, as horror is its own dimension of gameplay. For instance, an action-focused video game will spare nothing to give the player the most physically and mentally stimulating hormones, just so everyone involved enjoys the experience. The task of slowly peeking around a corner to see if an enemy is waiting for you to fall into their trap is a trip in and of itself. You never know what skill and sheer gaming talent you may pull out of God knows where at any given moment, just to save yourself from a situation you had almost no chance of getting out of. Even in a puzzle game, you may not have the slightest idea of what piece you'll figure out goes where. I may just be a niche-focused geek and/or pandering to an audience that seems to like a certain type of game, but forms like horror, thriller, and suspense have their own imprint on players due to the fact that a quality scare will resonate with players long after the initial fright. It would be a legitimate challenge to find anyone who couldn't recollect a single thing about their first puppet combo scare, or anyone who wasn't scarred for life playing a single second of any games from the Outlast franchise. I describe what gamers get when they look back on games from the past is a sense of dreadful nostalgia. Not wanting to venture back into a nightmare, but still being so curious as to not stop thinking about what horrified them the most. What could have made such a form into what it is today? How could something this unique even come to be? Throughout the decades that video games have existed, horror, like many other genres, has seen significant changes, improvements, worsenings, refinements, revamps, whatever noun you could add on to such a redundant sentence by closing your eyes and opening up to any page in a thesaurus. The process of these types of video games changing over time has certainly been ripe with eventfulness to say the least. From countable pixels on a screen, to games being produced by major studios, to whatever the horror scene is today. But the genesis of it all started in 1972. According to the Jaws wiki, Killer Shark is a first-person electromechanical shooter arcade game that was published by Sega in 1972. The objective of the game is for the player to repeatedly shoot the approaching sharks. The arcade received moderate success, but gained considerable notoriety after it was featured in Jaws, seen being played by a gamer at a local beachside arcade in the community of Amity Island. The use of the game is shown as a juxtaposition of the local government's disregard of a shark warning by local police chief Martin Brody. This bit of levity left a major impression on audiences and made Killer Shark the first and most famous shark arcade game ever. Less than 5 are known to exist. It's blatantly obvious that this is an insanely early, primitive form of this kind of video game, but it plays a pivotal role in horror game history since it's the first known of its kind to use a suspense-type feeling of dread encroaching upon the player. Just under a decade past the era of video games being limited exclusively to arcades, in February of 1982, Atari released Haunted House. The player, represented by a pair of eyes, must navigate the haunted mansion of the late Zachary Graves to recover 3 pieces of an urn. The game has been identified as one of the earliest examples of the survival horror genre by a GameSpy article. It's comically amusing at best, but not scary, and could do better at worst. The first horror movie video game, titled The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and based off of the same movie with the same name, wasn't so scary in that it had you playing as the bad guy, with the most horrifying thing being how boring the game was. It's your typical Atari high score based game where the goal is to get the highest score you can before your fuel runs out. You score points by slaughtering masses of pixels that look like they're supposed to be young girls. It's no wonder why this game wasn't well received, as the premise is literally for the player, who are mostly young kids, to go out and slaughter innocent girls. More into the game, you start to get stuck on objects, and one could see why the game becomes unfun really quickly. On the heels of Haunted House, Wizard Video Games released a cartridge based on John Carpenter's Halloween in 1983. It must have been amazing for gamers and horror fans alike to see an infamous horror movie in all of its Atari glory, with its signature theme, head decapitations, and characters, but just minutes in, and it's again, not scary to anyone over the age of 3. It has you playing as Laurie Strode, rescuing what looks like the same kid from Michael Myers. It's pretty gory for an Atari game, seeing as when he kills you, your head gets cut off and you spurt 2 streams of blood from your neck. Definitely a gore breakthrough since it's probably the first head decapitation ever in a video game. Although not horror per se, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Activision's Ghostbusters game. Released in 1984 at the height of the Bustin' Mania, it does the impossible by capturing the immense fun of its big screen inspiration. This is thanks to game designer David Crane, the man who previously brought us Pitfall and went on to create innovative titles like Little Computer People and the underrated A Boy and His Blob. From the opening title screen, which features a follow the bouncing ball rendition of Ray Parker Jr.'s mega hit, to the then revolutionary inventory control/upgrade portion of the game. It was clear that Activision's Ghostbusters was something truly special, at least on the Commodore 64. For whatever reasons, much of the game's weird inventiveness didn't port over to other systems and consoles nearly as well. In 1985, some quality, although not scary, horror was actually put into the arcades that were hurt by the video game crash, with Ghosts and Goblins, excellent game by the way, being introduced and ported onto so many consoles and handhelds. The side-scrolling masterpiece remains one of the most addictive and fun entries from the golden age of video games. While the game was successful enough to spawn a franchise that includes follow-ups like Ghouls and Ghosts and Maximo, it never quite captured the imagination of a Super Mario Bros. Or Sonic the Hedgehog, probably because Arthur didn't have his pants on, and the game opens up with a couple right after having sex in a cemetery. While gamers in the 80s were trying desperately to get Arthur's clothes back on, they were also trying to avoid getting killed by Jason in the Friday the 13th computer game. It had the player playing as one counselor at a time while trying to both kill Jason and ensure the other counselors were safe as well. This same premise was used in the 1989 NES version developed by LJN. It made significant progress in the horror genre since it's one of the more fleshed out horror games in the 8-bit era. Additionally, Creative Spark's Mad Doctor was released for the Commodore 64 in 1985. You probably have never heard of this one, but you should go through the trouble of searching for some sort of gameplay of it. Playing as a, mad doctor living in a small English village, it has you trying to find the body parts needed to make your own Frankensteins. You'll either do some grave digging or just straight up murder townspeople who are foolish enough to go walking around at night. You also have to avoid the pitchfork-wielding locals and make your way to a Stonehenge locale to bring your creation to life. Yet another early horror game that has you playing as the bad guy. And if I wanted to be a sociopathic, homicidal, grave-robbing lunatic trying to fuse body parts together, I just didn't realize. Uninvited was a point-and-click game that debuted on the Apple Macintosh in 1986 before being somewhat revamped for the NES with a surprisingly really metal cover in 1991. In it, players must explore a creepy abandoned house in search for their lost sibling. It may seem like primitive design in 2021, but good point-and-click horror still persists to this day. In terms of being scary, literally doing anything else on the Macintosh exerts more agony and fear onto a user, but it changed horror in that it used itself to slowly build up a sense of dread. In 1987, Castlevania hit the scene, bringing with it a non-linear, memorable, side-scrolling fun to the NES library, and further cementing Konami's reputation as revolutionary in the gaming world. Everything vampiric and gothic you could think of was in this game, from menacing castles to undead creatures to the weirdest form of Dracula imaginable. In the same year, LucasArts released Maniac Mansion, a not deliberately scary point-and-click adventure game that almost instantly resonated with audiences because of its humor, versatile gameplay, the characters you played with impacting the story resulting in multiple outcomes. Seems normal now, but was one of the first of its kind back then. And memorable music going to show a title can be simple while giving customers such memorable gameplay. Namco got into horror game development with the release of Splatterhouse in 1988, a haunted house beat-em-up that has the player as a college student, slashing and punching creatures like demons and bubbles. Like the dirty bubble from SpongeBob? Anyway, punching through creatures to find their missing girlfriend. It was one of the many few horror fighting button mash games, demonstrating that any format of game can be considered horror. 5 years later, an ID game named Doom would come in with its demon-killing marine and intricate, groundbreaking level design, weaponry, and craftsmanship that would go on to define the next couple decades of action horror. This was the game that exploded first-person shooters upon the public's consciousness, while also proving that giving free shareware levels to players can be a viable business model, or, as Gen X knows it as, the thing their parents thought caused every last one of their problems. Shortly after the release of Doom, and especially into the mid-90s, not just horror, but gaming itself changed exponentially. Graphics technology and computing speed were rocketing at the rate they could process high-input controls and high-output video, leading to much more 3D third-person based horror, with much more detailed environments, deeper games, and more controls, resulting in games feeling fuller to the player, and molding digital products into what they look like today, once they were ushered out of the era of 5-button controllers, countable pixels, and bit numbers under 30. Changes in technology like this only paved the way for exponentially greater fear. Resident Evil drew on many features and scares that other games had already established, with its zombie-filled mansion and reliance on puzzles to break up weapon-based combat. What Shinji Mikami and his team managed to do was polish these familiar ideas, marrying a brilliant control system to entertaining, terrifying gameplay. Over 11 million copies of the game have been sold to date, spawning a franchise that's still giving gamers sleepless nights decades after the fact. Resident Evil moved the horror genre forward with a hefty dose of action. 3 years later, a new contender to the terror throne emerged, borrowing much from Capcom's zombie shooter. However, Silent Hill was a key title in reminding gamers that horror didn't need to be dished out with a shotgun. The psychological thrills of Silent Hill were simple, a brilliant soundtrack mixed with dark rooms and a failing flashlight. The location of Silent Hill has been revisited by vastly more sophisticated titles, but they all owe a great deal to this foggy adventure. A more subtle approach to horror that serves as an alternative to straight-up in-your-face terror. To ensure you don't get any sleep for the next month, be sure to check out the playable teaser of Hideo Kojima's Silent Hills. This type of horror, as well as more direct forms of it, went on to cultivate their own subgenres in the subsequent decades, most notably in 2009 with the release of Demon Souls. Demon Souls took undead foes to new heights, pitting players against monsters that haunt their waking hours, not because of any psychological sophistication, but rather because of how hard they were to slay. If you've never set foot in the world of Demon Souls, we urge you to seek it out, or to skip its modern champions, Dark Souls, and the newly released and superb Bloodborne. Shortly after, Slender became all the rage in 2012, and it made the careers of some Let's Play YouTubers. As soon as you begin your search for notes, it's an attempt to piece together what's going on. The faceless, suited Slenderman will start hunting you. There have been several sequels, ports, and remakes, all of them bound to make you throw your computer out of the nearest window. Not out of terror for the game, but how underwhelmingly developed they are. Post-2012, the majority of horror games now consisted of low-budget, somewhat underproduced, and indie horror games, most of which were downloadable for free on the internet. There were undoubtedly some exceptions like the Outlast series, The Evil Within, the sequels to Dead Island, but the majority of horror isn't made by AAA developers anymore, but individuals. As a video game genre, horror fell out of favor among AAA developers around the end of the Double Odds. The case can be made that financial duds like Resident Evil 6 and Dead Space 3 played a significant role here, even though both of these franchises were, and remain, highly popular. In my view, another part of the problem was that these games increasingly focused on action horror as opposed to survival horror. Just to clarify, action horror games typically lean towards combat rather than adventure or puzzle solving. I'd argue that many of these action horror games wore out their welcome for players well before the credits rolled. The indie space rapidly stepped into the breach. Something similar also happened with 2D games, especially platformers. A clear example, and one of the earliest in this group of indie horror titles, was Amnesia: The Dark Descent, released in 2010 by Frictional Games. Frictional's design team have, in the past, discussed the reasoning behind moving combat from their games and focusing on story and atmosphere. They felt that combat itself removed the terror and dread experienced by the player, and that it was really removed from the core spirit of horror. This is a point I disagree with, and I plan to make a video on in the further future. What's clear is that actionless horror games became a popular genre for indie-inspired games, the Outlast series, and Five Nights at Freddy's. All of these franchises have something in common with each other, both the removal of combat and a heavy focus on story and lore. Five Nights at Freddy's has grown into a larger phenomenon in part due to fan theories surrounding the core experience, as well as connections between the various games. After decades of improvement, worsenings, refinements, revamps, recreations, or anything else done to alter the status quo of the genre into something new, it's truly amazing to see how far the gaming world has come, and it can enlighten a player on what era of it was truly for them, giving them more insight into what they could get more enjoyable gameplay out of. From the early 70s to the late 90s, any archetype that could classify as horror underwent drastic shifts from different demands to the gaming market. Loss of favor with traditional formats, first-person perspectives, then higher quality 3D third-person perspectives, as console technology went on, and many crucial foundations of horror that still have their ground in today's games were first implemented. From the early 2000s to now, horror has fallen out of favor with mainstream developers, but there are many excellent developers who enter the call of duty to fill that void. The genre as a whole has been polished over the years to where no matter the external atmosphere, context, personal mood, time of day, season, or anything outside of the game that could make a difference in someone's vibe, could distract the player from most of what a quality horror experience has to offer. When a game has the right feeling to it, gameplay that feels right, graphics that complement its overall style, controls carefully forged to make an adrenaline-fueled moment, and most importantly, a good scare, that game can't really be compared to any other genre or style of presentation, as horror is its own dimension of gameplay.